Okay, so many thanks to organizers for inviting me. I really enjoy beautiful country here. What they're doing in this paper? So in this paper, the agents are using observations of past inflation to infer the level of long rate inflation. And the agents apparently believe that the economy could exist in two regimes, the steady regime and period of rapid changes, and therefore they're using either decreasing gain or constant gain algorithm, as in Marset and Nicolini. And the switch between the two regimes is dependent on an observed difference between model consistent and agent subjective one step ahead forecast error. And I would not speak much about that, right? There was discussion during the talk. And of course, this difference could be pretty well expressed as weighted average of past forecast errors, which allows the authors to say that it is a sequence of one-dimensional and large forecast errors, which might lead to a switch to a different regime. And then when they estimate, when the agents get this perceived long-run average inflation, they are using this perceived inflation in simple MK-like model to index prices. So this pi bar is used for partial indexation of prices. And monetary policy, which is underlying this model, is something like optimal discretion, and if I understand correctly, marginal costs are evolving as exogenous R1 process. Now, so then they linearize the model, estimate using data for CPI and several measured CPI expectations. They find very good correspondence between the model concept of this long-run average and the long-run measured expectations. And this correspondence is worse in case of two comparison models. So there is a horse race. In case of no switching, or just pure constant gain and no learning, when there is exogenous evolution of this long-run inflation average, both of these models perform worse than the baseline. Now, this is a very nice paper. It forced me to think very hard about what does it mean to estimate the ESG model using measured expectations, especially if you include periods where measured expectations and realized inflations are grossly out of sync as they were in 1970s and 2000s. Now, what I will try to look at, I will talk about transmission mechanism of the model, and I will talk about speed of adjustment of learning implied by estimated parameters, and maybe some questions about implementation of learning algorithm, but in all my presentations, I never come to conclusions. And international dimension is out of my reach, so I'm leaving this out. Okay, now transmission mechanism. So the estimated gamma p is pretty small. 595% interval is basically below 0.9 in all estimated countries, and t is large. Median is around 0.8. This means that expected inflation in the model is determined mostly by pi bar and st, and this shock, which I actually don't know how to interpret, whether it is monetary policy error or cost push shock. But there is almost no role for endogenous evolution of inflation. There is almost no role for lagged inflation. Now, given that this shock ST is unobserved, the estimation procedure could shape it to match the observed inflation. Okay, I would guess that if we have a look at path of this ST and compare it to observed inflation, then this would be pretty similar. This time series would be pretty similar. It is suggestive that ST is found to be very persistent, and if you look at measured inflation expectations, they are also very persistent. And then if this is so, then transmission mechanism for pi t is basically dominated by the shock, which reflects expectations. So this model might be driven by the structural expectational shock. And the internal transmission mechanism for inflation is strongly emphasized. Now, of course, this is, if you look at the data, this is what you should expect, because inflation expectations contain a lot of information about future inflation. I was writing a paper with Raf on adaptive learning and survey expectations of inflation for the last 3 years. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. So what I'm saying is partially informed by what I learned there. So in our project, we use real-time macro data and to explain the SPF forecasts. And of course, if you are trying to explain forecast, you need to use the same information set as the SPF forecasters were having when they were forming these expectations. Now, in this paper uses CPI inflation and CPI inflation forecasts. And given that CPI is almost never revised, the complication with real-time data, they avoid this complication. Okay, probably everyone knows how real-time data is done and SPF. So the only thing I want to stress here is that the data, macroeconomic data for quarter T are released at the end of the first month of quarter T+1. And for SPF, quarterly SPF is released in the middle of the second month of the quarter. Therefore, SPF, what is called SPF nowcast, it already, these people have seen already macroeconomic data. Now, kind of a simple regression that I'm running just to tell you what I'm talking about. So if you look at first release of inflation at time T+1 and regress it on the whole bunch of real-time variables, which are usually included into Smets and Wouters model. So first, second release of output growth, consumption growth, investment growth, real wage growth, GDP deflator, inflation, federal funds rates, and hours index. Then you will get R squared, which is 0.74. But if you regress the same first release of inflation on the same wide variables plus SPF nowcast, you get better, like 0.84. But then you throw away all macro variables and leave just SPF nowcast. And you get almost the same R squared. So SPF nowcast is almost a sufficient statistics for all the macro variables that we could show at Smets and Wouters model. SPF nowcast, at least when you're talking about 1 quarter ahead inflation forecast, is incredibly informative. That basically explains why inflation expectation could become so dominating if you're trying to include inflation expectations into a model. Okay, I do several other exercises with lagged SPF forecast and using great moderation period. The story is the same. And then kind of what you could do with Smets and Wouters type model. So we do estimation using first and second release of the data. Second release of the data is taken to be final truth. There is measurement error on the first release. And we also have measurement equation for for SPF nowcast. So SPF nowcast measures inflation expectations. So if you do this very basic thing, and this is like the Slobodyan and Wouters 2012, where agents are forecasting all forward-looking variables as autoregressions of order 2. So you get some posterior, and this measurement error on SPF nowcast explains about 35% of nowcast. And at 1 quarter ahead and 20% of unconditional variance. Then kind of seemingly logical step would be to let agents see the SPF. So we add this PLM into agent's PLM on inflation, we add 2 lakhs of SPF. And the model becomes incredibly better, 100 units of log likelihood, right? Incredibly good model. However, if you look at variance decomposition, you now see that this shock explains 99% of SPF unconditional variance and 90% of unconditional variance of inflation and 43% of variance of interest rate. And even some non-trivial amount of variance for real inflation. So the structural expectational shock totally dominates the model. Especially, and this is because SPF nowcast is so informative. You could repeat this exercise with lagged SPF forecast, which does not, these people did not have a look at latest data, and the basic story would be very similar. So I personally, I'm very careful about putting expectations, measured expectations into the model. And yes, is there too much of a good thing? There are 4 variables measuring expectations and only 1 measuring actual inflation. And as I said, there are periods of systematic difference in 70s and 2000s. And probably likelihood evaluation would like to fit expectations rather than actual inflation, especially given that you have 4 expectations versus just 1 inflation. So again, you are biasing your estimation towards total dominance of expectational variable. Okay, and here, yes, probably I should talk to you about this later. Basically, this model is effectively steady-state learning, and I'm not sure how consistent it is with the approximating ordinary differential equation of this model. If you compute speeds of convergence of mean dynamics ODE here along different directions, it's not really clear to me that the agents could have converged on coefficient for lagged inflation and on the shock, but they did not yet converge on coefficient for the constant. Okay, given your estimated variables. And yeah, I definitely have to finish. I do have big problems with gain and switching threshold, but I probably should finish.